The Dark Story of Budweiser Empire. Mansion. Grant's Farm. Dawn breaks over Missouri clay. The air hangs thick, humid, stinking of manure and money. Through a wall of ancient oaks, you can almost see it, the big house, 3 stories of red brick and limestone rising from 281 acres, like a Bavarian fever dream transplanted to America. 26 rooms, 14 bathrooms, 6 Tiffany windows catching morning light, each one worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime. August Anheuser Busch Sr. built this palace between 1910 and 1913 with $300,000 in beer money, the equivalent of roughly $9 million today, while construction workers sweated 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for 20 cents an hour, in an era when 23,000 American laborers died on the job every single year. This is a mansion built by liquid gold, baptized in sweat, and consecrated by blood. Here's what nobody mentions in the tour brochures. On February 10, 1934, Busch Sr. wrote, "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children," put a revolver to his stomach, and pulled the trigger in a second-floor bedroom. In 1976, his grandson Peter Busch shot his best friend David Leaker through the skull in this same house, pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and never spent a day in prison. In 1983, another heir left a young woman dead after a car crash and walked away. In 2010, a 27-year-old aspiring model was found lifeless in an heir's bed. And on July 13, 2008, the last Busch to run the brewery signed away 156 years of family control for $52 billion to a Belgian conglomerate, discovering too late that the family owned just 4% of their own empire. The math is brutal. For every dollar of wealth extracted from American throats, there was a body count. The only question is whether anyone still remembers to do the accounting. The story begins where most American fortunes begin, with somebody else's failure. In 1857, a German immigrant named Eberhard Anheuser bought a struggling St. Louis brewery called the Bavarian Brewery for what amounted to pocket change. The previous owners had run it into the ground with mismanagement and debt, and Anheuser saw an opportunity. He had money but no real understanding of beer, no intuition for the chemistry of fermentation or the delicate balance of hops and malt that separates mediocre brewing from excellence. What he did have was capital and a son-in-law named Adolphus Busch, another German immigrant who'd arrived in America in 1857 with ambition that exceeded his means and a willingness to work that exceeded his principles. Adolphus married Anheuser's daughter Lily in 1861, just as the Civil War was tearing the country apart, and by the time the war ended in 1865, he'd convinced his father-in-law to let him manage the brewery. The timing was perfect, almost supernaturally so. America was industrializing at a terrifying pace, cities swelling with factory works, immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Poland, everywhere, who needed something cheap to wash down the day's humiliations. They worked in steel mills, meat packing plants, textile factories, construction sites. They worked until their hands bled and their backs broke, and at the end of a 12-hour shift, they wanted beer. Not good beer necessarily, just beer that was cold and cheap and available. Adolphus Busch understood something fundamental that his father-in-law never quite grasped. Beer wasn't about taste, it was about distribution. If you could get your product into every saloon, every corner store, every workingmen's club from St. Louis to San Francisco, it didn't matter if it was the best beer in the world. It just had to be there, ready, when a thirsty man reached for it. By the 1880s, Adolphus had pioneered pasteurization for beer, a process developed by Louis Pasteur in France for wine and milk, allowing Budweiser to survive long train journeys without spoiling. This was revolutionary. Before pasteurization, beer had to be consumed locally because it would go bad within days. After pasteurization, you could ship beer across the country, and it would arrive drinkable. Adolphus built a network of refrigerated railcars and distribution depots. He opened breweries in multiple cities. He advertised aggressively, buying newspaper ads and billboards and sponsoring events. He created the first national beer brand in American history, Budweiser, a name stolen from the Czech town of Budweis, famous for its brewing tradition, repackaged as an all-American triumph. The Czechs protested naturally. Adolphus didn't care. He owned the trademark in the United States, and that was all that mattered. The company grew grotesquely wealthy. By 1901, Anheuser-Busch was producing over 1 million barrels annually, making it the largest brewery in the country. The profits were staggering. Adolphus built himself a mansion near the brewery in St. Louis, then another one, then bought property in Germany where he could summer in the style of minor nobility. He collected art, horses, fine wines. He donated to charities and civic projects, the way wealthy men do when they want to be remembered as benefactors rather than profiteers. And he raised his children, including August Anheuser-Busch Sr., to believe that wealth was a kind of divine right, that their success was evidence of superior character rather than fortunate timing and ruthless business practices. Adolphus Busch became one of the richest men in St. Louis, and his children inherited not just money, but the expectation of perpetual dominance, the belief that the Busch name was synonymous with power, and that power was forever. Among those children was August Anheuser-Busch Sr., born December 29, 1865, into the kind of privilege that allows a man to mistake luck for destiny. He grew up watching his father transform beer into an empire, and when Adolphus died in 1913, August inherited the presidency of Anheuser-Busch along with the certainty that success was his birthright. He was 47 years old. He'd been groomed for this his entire life. What he hadn't been groomed for was prohibition, or the Great Depression, or the weight of trying to keep an empire alive when the very product it sold became illegal overnight. But that would come later. First, August needed a palace worthy of his station. In 1903, August purchased 281 acres of land in what would become Grantwood Village, Missouri, about 10 miles southwest of downtown St. Louis. The land had history, layers of it, going back generations. It had once been farmed by Ulysses S. Grant before he became a general, before he became president, back when he was just another man trying to scratch a living from dirt that didn't want to give. Grant had built a log cabin there in the 1850s with his own hands and a few neighbors who helped, because that's how things worked in those. You raised a barn or built a cabin together, and you didn't ask for payment because next month you'd need the same help. Grant called the cabin hardscrabble because nothing about it was easy. The soil was poor. The crops failed more often than they succeeded. Grant eventually gave up farming and went off to the Mexican War, then came back, then failed at farming again, then finally found his calling in the Civil War, where his particular talent for violence and endurance made him a hero. But the cabin stayed, a reminder of what failure looked like before success rewrote the story. By the time August Busch bought the property in 1903, Grant's cabin had been moved to the 1904 World's Fair as a tourist curiosity. Come see where a president once lived in poverty. And August bought it back for $8,000, a sum that would have fed a working-class family for a decade, and had it relocated to his new estate as a kind of historical trophy. The irony was rich, a brewing magnate buying the cabin of a failed farmer to sit on his private hunting grounds, a monument to American bootstrapping repurposed as lawn ornament for a man whose boots had been strapped since birth. But August didn't see the irony. He saw an opportunity to link his name to Grant's, to suggest that wealth and presidential greatness occupied the same moral universe, that owning the cabin meant something beyond just owning property. The property became his private hunting ground, a place where a brewing magnate could play aristocrat on weekends, far from the stink of malt and fermentation that funded the fantasy. He stocked it with deer and elk, exotic game imported from other states and sometimes other countries. He built stables. He entertained business associates and politicians, hosting fox hunts and shooting parties where men in expensive clothes killed animals for sport and called it tradition. This wasn't unique to August. Every industrialist of the era did the same thing. They bought land, built estates, imported European customs, and pretended they were nobility. But nobility implies inherited responsibility, a sense of duty to the land and the people who work it. What August and his peers had was wealth without responsibility, power without accountability. They could hunt on their land because they owned it, and they owned it because they'd extracted enough profit from workers who didn't own anything. But August wanted more than a weekend retreat. He wanted a statement, a physical declaration that the Busch name had transcended mere commerce and entered the realm of cultural permanence. Between 1910 and 1913, he commissioned architects Frederick Widman and Robert Walsh, specialists in brewery design, men who understood how to build structures that declared permanence through sheer mass and architectural confidence, to construct what would become known simply as the Big House. The style was French Renaissance revival by way of Bavarian excess, a three-story brick mansion with limestone detailing that caught the light and turned the whole structure into a kind of jewel set against Missouri greenery. Turrets, arched entrances, a forecourt that suggested you were approaching something holy or at least something that demanded reverence. The roof echoed Château de Chambord in France's Loire Valley, the massive royal hunting lodge built for King Francis I in the 16th century, though scaled down, Americanized, made practical for Midwest winters instead of French summers. The architectural influences were deliberate and eclectic. The red brick and limestone detailing came from Louis XIII style, popular in northern France. The roofline and arched entrances were pure French Renaissance. The turrets and chimneys borrowed from Neo-Louis XIII style found in Normandy. The piazzas were Italian, incongruous, but added because apparently every great house needed some Mediterranean flair. The Ionic columns flanking the entrance and the German red roof tiles reminded everyone that this was American, a melting pot of European traditions filtered through the lens of New World ambition and brewing money. The design was attributed to Frederick Widman and Robert Walsh, working in partnership, with Walsh named as principal architect. Neither man had studied nor lived in France, but they'd studied photographs and plans, the way architects in the American heartland often did, borrowing grandeur secondhand and adapting it to local materials and budgets that wouldn't support actual Loire Valley craftsmanship. Inside, the house was a museum of excess. The floors were oak, walnut, and marble, each room a different combination depending on its function and the impression August wanted it to make. The oak came from American forests, the walnut from select trees chosen for their grain, the marble imported from quarries in Italy and Vermont. 6 Tiffany stained glass windows depicted a stag in a forest, each pane a small fortune. Tiffany glass was handcrafted, each piece individually selected for color and texture, the kind of work that required artisans who trained for years to achieve the luminous quality that made Tiffany famous. The windows filtered sunlight into patterns of green and gold, turning the mansion's interior into a kind of cathedral where the god being worshipped was wealth itself. There was a perforated ceiling above the main landing, an architectural flourish that allowed sound from the third-floor ballroom to drift through the house like a ghost. You could stand on the ground floor and hear music from parties 2 stories above, a reminder that celebration was always happening somewhere, even if you weren't invited. An ornate gun room displayed hunting trophies, mounted deer heads, elk antlers, the taxidermied remains of animals shot on the grounds or imported from hunting expeditions out west. These weren't just decorations, they were evidence of dominion, proof that August Busch could kill things for sport and mount them on walls because he had the money and the leisure to do so. The reception rooms featured ornamental plasterwork that took months to complete, intricate moldings and ceiling medallions that required skilled craftsmen working with hand tools, applying layer after layer of plaster, letting each one dry, sanding, smoothing, painting. The kind of detail that required hundreds of hours of labor and materials imported from Europe because American plaster wasn't fine enough for a house that cost $300,000. The construction firm was Fruin and Colnan, a saint. Louis Company known for large projects, commercial buildings, breweries, the kind of structures that required coordination of dozens of trades and hundreds of workers. The final cost, $300,000 in 1913 dollars, a figure that needs translation to make sense to modern ears. In 2024, that's roughly $9 million adjusted for inflation, though the real comparison isn't to money but to labor. What did $300,000 buy in 1913? It bought 2 years of construction. It bought red brick manufactured in Missouri kilns by men who worked in 120-degree heat, shoveling coal into furnaces. It bought limestone shipped from quarries where workers used dynamite and hand drills to extract blocks of stone, then loaded them onto flatbed railcars for transport. It bought Tiffany windows fabricated in New York workshops where glassblowers and artisans worked with molten glass and copper foil to create patterns that would catch light for a century. It bought oak floors cut from trees felled in American forests, milled into planks, kiln-dried, planed smooth, installed by carpenters who worked on their knees all day. It bought walnut paneling, marble columns, ornamental plaster, copper gutters, slate roofing, iron fixtures, everything custom-made or imported because a house this expensive couldn't use standard materials. And it bought labor, hundreds of workers. Carpenters, masons, glaziers, plumbers, electricians. The mansion had electricity from the start, a luxury many Americans wouldn't have for another 2 decades. Laborers whose names never appeared in any record. Men who worked 10 to 12-hour shifts, often 6 or 7 days a week, under conditions that would be illegal today and were barely regulated then. In 1913, America was in the final years before labor protections became law. There were no meaningful safety regulations. No workers' compensation worth the name. No 8-hour workday. No weekends guaranteed by law. No child labor laws that were enforced. Factories routinely employed children as young as 10, and nobody thought it was unusual because that's how the system worked. You needed income, you sent your kids to work, and if they got hurt or killed, well, that was the cost of being poor. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported approximately 23,000 industrial deaths in 1913 among a workforce of 38 million. That's a death rate of 61 per 100,000 workers. For comparison, the current occupational fatality rate in America is 3 per 100,000, a 95% reduction over the last century. In 1913, you were 18 times more likely to die on the job than you are today. And that figure only counted deaths, not injuries. It didn't count the men who lost fingers to saws, hands to machinery, lungs to silica dust, hearing to factory noise. It didn't count the men who died years later from cancers caused by chemical exposure, or infections from untreated cuts, or chronic pain from injuries that healed wrong because they couldn't afford doctors. The 23,000 deaths were just the bodies that dropped on site, the ones that couldn't be ignored or explained away. In 1913, if you got hurt on the job, you were fired. If you died, your family got nothing unless they could prove the employer was negligent, which was nearly impossible because the courts were stacked in favor of employers. There was a legal doctrine called assumption of risk. If you took a dangerous job, you assumed the risk of injury, so the employer wasn't liable. There was contributory negligence. If the worker made any mistake that contributed to the accident, the employer wasn't liable. There was the fellow servant rule. If another worker caused the accident, the employer wasn't liable. These weren't obscure technicalities. They were the foundation of labor law in the United States before workers' compensation became mandatory. And they meant that if you died building August Busch's mansion, your widow and children got nothing because you'd assumed the risk when you took the job. New York passed the first modern workers' compensation law in 1910, requiring employers to compensate injured workers automatically without requiring proof of negligence. Within 10 years, most states had followed suit. But in 1913, when the big house was being built, Missouri didn't have workers' compensation yet. If you fell off a scaffold while installing a Tiffany window, if a brick wall collapsed on you, if you were crushed by a load of marble being unloaded from a wagon, your family might get a small settlement from the employer out of charity, but they had no legal right to it. More likely, they got nothing. Your body was buried, another worker was hired to replace you, and construction continued. The men who built August Busch's palace worked in a world where your life had a market value, and that value was very, very low. The average factory worker in 1913 made 20 cents an hour, roughly $600 a year, if they worked full-time, which they rarely did because layoffs were constant and injuries frequent. At that rate, it would take a single worker 500 years to earn what August Busch spent building his mansion. But of course, it wasn't built by one worker. It was built by dozens, maybe 100, maybe more, depending on how you count the men who quarried the stone, cut the lumber, manufactured the bricks, fabricated the windows, forged the iron, everything that went into creating a structure this large. Most of them were immigrants, Germans and Irish and Italians, who'd come to America looking for opportunity and found 12-hour shifts and wages that barely covered rent. They lived in tenements, crowded boarding houses, company housing if they worked for large firms. They sent money back to families in the old country. They saved what little they could, hoping their children might have better lives, knowing that they themselves would never escape the trap of wage labor. August Busch didn't exploit these men personally. He didn't make them work 12-hour days or pay them 20 cents an hour. He just benefited from a system that did. He hired a construction firm, the firm hired foremen, the foreman hired workers, and somewhere along that chain, the wages were set and the hours were determined, and the safety protocols, such as they were ignored because profit margins were thin and competition was fierce. And if you didn't like the conditions, there were 10 men behind you willing to take your job. This is how systems of exploitation work. They diffuse responsibility so thoroughly that nobody feels personally accountable. The workers who built Grant's farm were exploited. But who exploited them? The construction firm? The foreman? The economic system itself? August Busch just signed checks and made decisions about Tiffany glass and marble. He didn't think about the men who installed them because he didn't have to. That was somebody else's problem. Here's what $300,000 meant in 1913. The average factory worker made 20 cents an hour, roughly $600 a year if they worked full-time, which they rarely did because layoffs were constant and injuries frequent. At that rate, it would take a single worker 500 years to earn what August Busch spent building his mansion. But of course, it wasn't built by one worker. It was built by dozens, carpenters, masons, glaziers, laborers, whose names never appeared in any record, men who worked 10 to 12-hour shifts, often 6 or 7 days a week, under conditions that would be illegal today. In 1913, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported approximately 23,000 industrial deaths among a workforce of 38 million. That's a death rate of 61 per 100,000 workers. For comparison, the current occupational fatality rate in America is 3 per 100,000. In 1913, there were no meaningful safety regulations, no workers' compensation laws worth the name, no union strong enough to protect anyone. If you got hurt on the job, you were fired. If you died, your family got nothing unless they could prove the employer was negligent, which was nearly impossible. The men who built August Busch's palace worked in a world where your life had a market value, and that value was very, very low. The mansion had 26 rooms and 14 bathrooms, an absurd luxury at a time when most American homes shared a single outhouse. It had a chapel, St. Hubert's, because apparently God needed to be close by when you had this much money. There were stables for 20 horses, quarters for farm workers and their families, a German-style Bauernhof built in 1914 at an additional cost of $250,000, designed to resemble a medieval Bavarian village, complete with carved wooden balconies and stork sculptures on the roofline, storks being symbols of good luck and protection from fire in German folklore, a kind of architectural insurance policy against fate. The estate employed a full-time staff just to maintain the grounds: gardeners, stablemen, housekeepers, cooks, valets, security. Every one of them dependent on August Busch's whims for their livelihood, and every one of them aware that their place in this world existed only to service the fantasy of a man who'd inherited his power and mistaken it for virtue. August moved into the big house in 1913, the same year he became president of Anheuser-Busch, following his father's death. He was at the height of his power. The brewery was producing beer faster than Americans could drink it. The mansion was complete. His wife Alice and their 5 children lived in comfort that would have been unimaginable to 99% of the country. Everything should have been perfect. It wasn't. Within 7 years, America would pass the 18th Amendment, and prohibition would become the law of the land. The industry that had built the Busch fortune would become illegal. And August would have to figure out how to keep an empire alive when its reason for existing had been outlawed. When prohibition took effect on January 16, 1920, it should have destroyed Anheuser-Busch, the company's entire business model. The only business model it had known for 6 decades was producing and selling alcohol, and suddenly alcohol was illegal, not regulated, not taxed more heavily, illegal. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, passed by Congress and ratified by the states, made the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors a federal crime. It was supposed to solve America's drinking problem, reduce crime, empty the prisons, strengthen families, make the country more productive. What it actually did was create a massive black market, enrich organized crime, corrupt law enforcement, and nearly kill an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of people and generated millions of dollars in tax revenue. For Anheuser-Busch, prohibition was an existential crisis. The brewery had survived economic depressions, labor strikes, competition from hundreds of smaller brewers, but it had never faced the prospect of its core product being outlawed. And yet August Busch Sr. was nothing if not adaptable. He pivoted hard. Almost immediately after prohibition took effect, the company began producing non-alcoholic beverages, soft drinks, Bevo, a near beer that tasted like beer but contained less than 0% 5% alcohol, the legal limit under prohibition. It sold moderately well, though nobody really wanted fake beer when real beer was what they'd been drinking for decades. The company also produced malt syrup, sold in cans with instructions that carefully explained how not to turn it into beer. Wink wink, because making beer at home for personal consumption was technically legal, even if commercial production wasn't. Malt syrup sales were enormous. Everybody knew what it was for, and nobody pretended otherwise. Anheuser-Busch started making ice cream, seriously. Industrial-scale ice cream production, leveraging the refrigeration infrastructure the company had built for beer. They made yeast for baking, because yeast used in brewing could also be sold to bakeries and home bakers. They manufactured truck bodies and refrigerated cabinets, using the company's woodworking and metalworking facilities to produce products that had nothing to do with beer but could keep workers employed and cash flowing. They produced corn products, corn syrup, corn oil, corn-based animal feed. They built engines for U.S. Navy submarines during World War I, a government contract that kept the company solvent when beer sales were collapsing. August diversified so aggressively that by the time Prohibition ended in 1933, Anheuser-Busch had transformed from a brewery into a conglomerate that just happened to brew beer when it was legal. The company survived when hundreds of other breweries collapsed, their equipment sold for scrap, their buildings repurposed into warehouses or demolished. It was a masterclass in corporate adaptation, the kind of thing business schools study when they teach crisis management. But it was also a period of enormous stress for August personally. He'd inherited an empire built on beer, his father's legacy, his grandfather's brewery, and now beer was a crime. The company that had once been an unstoppable money machine, printing profit faster than the Treasury printed currency, was now a scrambling collection of side hustles, each one marginally profitable, none of them remotely comparable to the beer business at its peak. August bore the weight of it personally. He attended board meetings where executives proposed new products. Maybe we should make baby food. Maybe we should produce pharmaceuticals. Maybe we should lease our facilities to other manufacturers. Every decision was a compromise, a retreat from the core business that had made the Busch name synonymous with American beer. The brewery itself, the massive complex of buildings along the St. Louis riverfront that his father had spent decades expanding, sat mostly idle. The fermentation tanks were cleaned and left empty. The bottling lines were shut down. The workers who'd spent their entire careers brewing beer were laid off or reassigned to making ice cream and yeast. The Clydesdales, the massive draft horses that Anheuser-Busch had used to pull beer wagons since 1903, were kept as a kind of living symbol, a reminder that someday, somehow, beer would be legal again and the company would need them. But nobody knew when that day would come, or if it would come at all. Prohibition had widespread support when it passed. Church groups, women's temperance organizations, progressive reformers who believed alcohol was destroying American families, they all wanted it, and they'd worked for decades to make it happen. There was no guarantee it would be repealed, not in August's lifetime anyway. The pressure showed in everything August did. His health deteriorated throughout the 1920s. He suffered from heart disease, likely caused or worsened by stress, poor diet, and the sedentary lifestyle of a wealthy executive. He developed dropsy, an old-fashioned term for edema, the swelling of body tissues caused by fluid retention, usually associated with heart or kidney failure. He had gout, a painful form of arthritis caused by uric acid buildup in the joints, excruciated by rich food and alcohol. Ironic for a man whose fortune came from selling alcohol to other people, while presumably indulging in it himself. The gout caused his feet and hands to swell and ache. Some days he couldn't walk without a cane. Some days he couldn't walk at all. By the early 1930s, even with Prohibition on its way out, it would be repealed in December 1933 when the 21st Amendment was ratified, ending 13 years of federal alcohol prohibition. August was a broken man, physically and psychologically. The mansion that was supposed to represent triumph had become a kind of mausoleum, too large, too expensive, too heavy with expectation and memory. He rattled around in there with his ghosts, his father's expectations, his own failures and compromises, the weight of trying to keep an empire alive when the very product it sold had been illegal for more than a decade. His wife Alice tried to manage his care, but there's only so much a spouse can do when someone is determined to suffer in silence. His children visited, but they had their own lives, their own concerns. August was alone in the ways that matter, surrounded by wealth and family, and still profoundly isolated by the burden of responsibility he'd carried since 1930. On February 10, 1934, just 2 months after Prohibition ended, August Busch Sr. woke up in his second-floor bedroom at Grant's farm. He was 68 years old. He'd been in severe pain for weeks, maybe longer. His doctor had been giving him morphine. That morning, August sat down and wrote a brief note. "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children." Then he took a revolver from his desk drawer, put it to his abdomen, and fired. The bullet punctured his heart. He died quickly. The St. Louis County coroner's jury ruled it a suicide due to long illness. Thousands of people came to the mansion to pay their respects, including senators and brewers and business magnates. His lawyer gave a eulogy praising August as a worthy son of a noble father, a great leader who saved the industry just as his father had created it. Nobody mentioned the gun. Nobody mentioned the note. Nobody mentioned that the man who'd built a French chateau in Missouri had chosen to die alone in a second-floor bedroom, surrounded by Tiffany glass and ornamental plaster, with a bullet in his gut. The big house sat mostly empty for 2 decades after August's death. His widow Alice didn't want to live there, too many ghosts, so she had a smaller cottage built on the property where she could spend her final years away from the main house. Occasionally the mansion was used for family gatherings, but mostly it just sat there, a monument to wealth that nobody particularly wanted to inhabit. That changed in the 1950s when August's son, August Busch Jr., known to everyone as Gussie, decided to make Grant's farm his primary residence. Gussie reopened the big house, moved in with his Swiss-born wife, Trudy, and began throwing parties. Lots of parties. The mansion came alive again, filled with St. Louis Cardinals players. Gussie had bought the baseball team in 1953. Celebrities, politicians, anyone who mattered in St. Louis or wanted to. In 1954, Gussie opened portions of Grant's farm to the public for free, turning the estate into a tourist attraction where families could see exotic animals and ride trams and drink complimentary Budweiser samples. It was brilliant marketing. By the mid-1950s, Life magazine was running photo spreads of Gussie standing next to elephants in his private zoo, the image of American success made flesh. The mansion was no longer a haunted palace, it was a kingdom, and Gussie was its benevolent king. But kingdoms have a way of rotting from. On February 10, 1976, exactly 42 years to the day after August Busch Sr.'s suicide, Gussie's son, Peter Busch, was in a bedroom at Grant's farm with his best friend, 23-year-old David William Leaker. Peter was 20 years old, the son of privilege, a young man who'd grown up surrounded by wealth and the unspoken understanding that consequences were for other people. He liked guns. He'd already shot himself in the leg once, practicing quick draws like he was in a Western. That night, Peter and David were in a bedroom together. Peter had a .38 caliber pistol. The exact sequence of events is disputed, but the outcome is not. The gun went off. The bullet entered David Leaker's skull. He died instantly. Peter Busch called for help, claimed the gun had fired accidentally as he tossed it onto a bed. The police came. There was an investigation, though how thorough it was remains a question worth asking. Peter was charged with manslaughter, not murder. He pleaded guilty. His sentence, 5 years probation, not a single day in prison. David Leaker was the son of the president of the So Good Potato Chip Company, a middle-class kid who'd been friends with a Busch heir and died for it. He was buried at Valhalla Cemetery. Peter Busch walked free, and within a few years, he'd been given a lucrative beer distributorship in Florida. The empire took care of its own. The 1970s were hard on the Busch family, or maybe the family was hard on itself. In 1974, Gussie's youngest daughter, Christina, died in a traffic accident at age 8. In 1976, Peter shot David Leaker. These weren't industrial accidents or acts of God. They were the kinds of tragedies that happen when wealth insulates you so completely from consequences that you start to believe the normal rules don't apply. But the real darkness was still gathering, and it would find its focus in August Busch IV, Gussie's grandson, a young man who seemed determined to test exactly how far a last name could carry you. August Busch IV, August the fourth, depending on who you ask and how much respect they think he deserves, was born into more wealth than most people can imagine, the kind of generational fortune that shapes your reality before you're old enough to understand that other people live differently. His great-great-grandfather Eberhard Anheuser bought the brewery. His great-grandfather Adolphus Busch turned it into an empire. His grandfather August Sr. built the mansion and survived Prohibition. His great-uncle Gussie ran the company and bought the Cardinals. August IV grew up knowing he was destined to inherit a piece of that empire, and that knowledge shaped him in ways both obvious and invisible, some of which made him successful and some of which made him dangerous. He was a risk-taker, a phrase people use when they want to be polite about recklessness, when they want to suggest that someone's poor decisions are actually evidence of boldness or entrepreneurial spirit. August IV drove powerboats at speeds that could kill you if you hit a wave wrong. He rode motorcycles fast enough that mistakes weren't survivable. He flew jet planes and helicopters, activities that require precision and calm judgment, neither of which August was particularly famous for. He participated in extreme sports, jet skiing, base jumping, whatever the adrenaline sport of the moment happened to be. He lived like a man who believed he was untouchable, and for a long time, he was right. When you're rich enough and connected enough, the normal rules don't apply. Or they apply differently, in ways that favor you, in ways that ensure consequences remain theoretical rather than actual. On the night of November 13, 1983, August Busch IV was a 20-year-old student at the University of Arizona in Tucson, the kind of school where wealthy kids from the Midwest went to get degrees in business or marketing while enjoying warm weather and a party culture that made education almost optional. August was studying there, though studying might be generous. He was present. He attended some classes. He socialized extensively, the way wealthy college students do when they know their futures are already secured regardless of grades or effort. That night, August went to a bar near campus with a 22-year-old woman named Michelle Frederick. The exact details of how they met, what their relationship was, how long they'd known each other, all of that is lost to time and police reports that were never fully made public. What we know is they left the bar together sometime after midnight and got into August's black Corvette, a car that screams both wealth and the kind of insecurity that requires expensive symbols to prove your worth. What happened next depends on who's telling the story, and since August claimed amnesia and Michelle Frederick died, there's only one version that matters from a legal standpoint, the version August's lawyers present. Sometime in the early hours of November 14, 1983, the Corvette crashed. The exact location, the exact time, the circumstances, all of it remained vague in official accounts. Michelle Frederick was killed. The cause of death was injuries sustained in the crash, though whether she died instantly or suffered before dying, whether she was conscious or unconscious, whether she might have survived with immediate medical attention, none of that was ever clarified in public statements. August Busch IV was found hours later at his home, not at the crash site. He had a fractured skull, a serious injury that suggests the impact was severe. He claimed he had amnesia, couldn't remember what happened, couldn't remember the crash, couldn't remember getting home, couldn't provide any useful information to investigators trying to determine what occurred. The investigation lasted 7 months. 7 months of police work, interviews, forensic analysis of the crash site and the vehicle, medical examinations, attempts to piece together a timeline that made sense. And at the end of those 7 months, authorities declined to press charges. The official reason: lack of evidence. They couldn't prove what had happened. They couldn't prove August was driving, though the car was registered to him and he was found with it later. They couldn't prove he was intoxicated, though they'd been at a bar. They couldn't prove negligence or recklessness or anything that would constitute criminal liability, so they closed the case. No trial, no charges. Michelle Frederick was buried, her family grieved, and August Busch IV walked away from a dead woman and a crashed car with nothing more than a fractured skull that eventually healed. 2 years later, in 1985, August was charged with assaulting a police officer in a separate incident, details of which were never widely reported, but involved some kind of altercation that escalated to physical violence. A jury acquitted him. Again, no consequences. The pattern was becoming clear, had probably been clear to anyone paying attention from the beginning. August Busch IV could do almost anything, and the machinery of wealth and influence would smooth it over, make it go away, ensure that consequences remained theoretical. This wasn't corruption in the obvious sense. Nobody was bribing judges or paying off prosecutors. It was something more systemic, more insidious. When you have enough money, you can afford the best lawyers. The best lawyers know how to exploit every technicality, every gap in the evidence, every procedural requirement that might trip up a prosecution. They know how to delay, negotiate, make the other side prove everything beyond any doubt. And if the other side can't prove it, which is hard when the defendant has amnesia and the other witness is dead, then the case falls apart. Michael Frederick's death should have been a turning point, the kind of tragedy that forces a family to reckon with what they've created, to ask whether wealth and privilege have immunized their children from accountability in ways that make them dangerous. But that's not what happened. August 4 went on with his life. He graduated or didn't, and it didn't matter because graduation wasn't the point. The point was waiting for his inheritance, which eventually arrived. In the mid-1980s, August joined the family business. He worked his way up through Anheuser-Busch, though "worked his way up" is a phrase that means something different when your last name is on the building. He was talented, no question. He became chief of marketing and oversaw some of the brewery's most successful ad campaigns, including the Budweiser frogs that became cultural icons in the 1990s. He understood branding. He understood how to sell beer to Americans who were already drinking beer, which is most of the job. In 2006, when his father, August Busch III, retired, August IV became CEO of Anheuser-Busch. He was 46 years old. He stood at the helm of the largest brewing company in America, a company that controlled roughly half the U.S. beer market with brands like Budweiser and Bud Light. He should have been unstoppable. He lasted 2 years. The problem wasn't August IV's competence, though historians will debate that. The problem was that by 2008, Anheuser-Busch was a publicly traded company, and the Busch family, despite the name, despite the legacy, despite 150 years of control, owned only about 4% of the company's shares. They'd sold off equity over the decades to raise capital, to expand, to compete in an increasingly global market. They'd traded control for growth, and now the bill was coming due. In June 2008, a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate called InBev made an unsolicited $46.3 billion offer to buy Anheuser-Busch outright. August 4 and the board rejected it, calling it an undervaluation. InBev came back with a higher offer, $52 billion, $70 per share, all cash. The Busch family didn't have enough shares to stop it. On July 13, 2008, after a month of legal battles and increasingly desperate maneuvering, Anheuser-Busch accepted the offer. The deal closed in November 2008. August Busch IV, the last of his line to run the brewery, signed away 156 years of family control. InBev renamed itself Anheuser-Busch InBev and became the largest brewing company in the world. August IV got a seat on the new company's board, but no operational role. The Budweiser empire, built on the backs of American workers and sold to American throats, was now owned by a European conglomerate. St. Louis mourned like they'd lost a piece of their identity, which they had. For August IV, the loss of the company was professional humiliation, but it wasn't the end of his troubles. On December 19, 2010, a 27-year-old aspiring model named Adrienne Nicole Martin was found dead in August Busch IV's bed at his estate in Huntley, an upscale St. Louis suburb. She was his girlfriend. There were no signs of trauma or illness. Police investigated. August's lawyer insisted there was absolutely nothing suspicious about her death. An autopsy was ordered, but results took weeks, and the cause of death remained ambiguous. Officials suggested an overdose was possible. August Busch IV was never charged with any crime. The investigation quietly closed. Adrienne Martin was buried, and the news cycle moved on. But for those paying attention, it was hard not to notice the pattern. Another woman, another death, another Busch heir walking away without consequence. The math at this point becomes difficult to. August Busch Sr. built a mansion with $300,000 in beer money, while workers died at a rate of 61 per 100,000. He killed himself in that mansion in 1934. His grandson Peter shot his best friend to death in the same mansion in 1976 and never saw the inside of a prison cell. His great-grandson August IV walked away from a dead woman in 1983, lost the family company in 2008, and had another woman die in his bed in 2010. The big house, this French chateau dropped into Missouri soil, had become a kind of black hole, pulling tragedy into its orbit with a gravity that wealth and privilege only seemed to amplify. And the question hanging over everything was whether the place itself was cursed or whether the curse was simply being a Busch. After the 2008 sale to InBev, Anheuser-Busch InBev leased Grant's Farm from the Busch family and continued operating it as a tourist attraction. The Clydesdales remained. The free beer remained. Families still visited to feed goats and ride trams through the deer park. The big house, though, stayed private, hidden behind trees, inaccessible to the public except for occasional guided tours of the grounds that never ventured inside. The mansion was still technically owned by a trust established by Gussie Busch for his children, and as Gussie's heirs aged, the question of what to do with Grant's Farm became increasingly fraught. Some wanted to keep it in the family. Some wanted to sell it. The St. Louis Zoo expressed interest in buying the property for $30 million to use it as a conservation and breeding facility for endangered animals. One of Gussie's sons, Billy Busch, who ran his own small beer company called Kräftig, wanted to buy Grant's Farm himself and turn it into the headquarters for his brewery. His siblings opposed him. The dispute went to court. By 2015, the Busch family was publicly feuding over Grant's Farm in a way that would have been unthinkable during Gussie's lifetime. 6 of Gussie's heirs controlled the trust that owned the property, but they couldn't agree on its future. Billy Busch offered to buy the farm for $26 million plus $8 million for. His siblings offered the same amount, but wanted to sell to the zoo. A judge ruled in June 2016 that Wells Fargo, the corporate trustee managing the property, would have the final say on who could buy it. Billy Busch immediately countered his siblings' offer by bidding $26,000 to Iwan, exactly $1 more, along with the $8 million for the mansion. His siblings accused him of not having the financial means to operate the property long-term. The zoo eventually withdrew its offer in March 2016, citing the family infighting as a primary reason. For more than a year, Grant's Farm's future hung in limbo, while the Busch heirs fought in court and in the press. Their dirty laundry aired for all of St. Louis to see. The dispute finally resolved in August 2017 when 5 members of the Busch family, Beatrice Busch von Gontard, Peter Busch, Trudy Busch Valentine, Andrew Busch, and Robert Herman Jr., formed an ownership group and agreed to purchase Grant's Farm from the family trust for $51 million. The sale included the big house, the surrounding 281 acres, and several nearby parcels, including a parking lot. The new owners announced they would keep Grant's Farm free and open to the public, continuing the tradition Gussie had started in 1954. They invited Billy Busch to join the ownership group, and he said he was considering it, though it's unclear if he ever did. The important thing was that Grant's Farm would remain in Busch hands, at least for now. Anheuser-Busch InBev agreed to continue operating the tourist attraction under a lease agreement, ensuring that the Clydesdales and free beer samples would remain. In November 2021, the 5-member Busch ownership group assumed full management operations from Anheuser-Busch InBev, taking direct control of the property for the first time in decades. The question is, what Grant's Farm represents now? For tourists, it's a free afternoon with animals and beer, a nostalgic slice of Americana where you can feed goats and pretend the world is simpler than it is. For the Busch family, it's a legacy they're desperate to preserve, the last physical proof that their name once meant something beyond a brand owned by a Belgian conglomerate. But for anyone willing to look past the Clydesdales and the complimentary Budweiser, Grant's Farm is something darker, a monument to the cost of American capitalism, built by men whose names we'll never know, financed by a product that made billions while paying laborers just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to escape. It's a mansion where a president shot himself, where a grandson shot his best friend, where women died and heirs walked free. It's 281 acres of carefully manicured grounds hiding a century of blood and broken promises under a veneer of charity and tradition. The Busch family's philanthropy is well documented. They donated money to hospitals, museums, disaster relief efforts. Anheuser-Busch sent water and supplies to victims of hurricanes, earthquakes, floods. The Budweiser Clydesdales became one of the most recognizable symbols in American advertising, associated with heartland values and honest work. The family owned the St. Louis Cardinals for decades, turning the team into a civic institution. They were, by many measures, good corporate citizens. But corporate citizenship doesn't erase the bodies. It doesn't bring back the workers who died building the mansion, the women who died in the heir's company, the friend who took a bullet to the head and got his killer 5 years probation. Charity is what you do with money after you've extracted it from people who had no choice but to give it to you. Philanthropy is the public face you put on private wealth. And the Busch family did both with a skill that almost makes you forget where the money came from in the first place. In 1913, when August Busch Sr. moved into the big house, America was on the verge of enormous change. Within a decade, women would have the vote, prohibition would become law, the country would fight a world war. Within 2 decades, the Great Depression would arrive, and men like August would have to reckon with the fact that the economic system that made them rich was also capable of destroying them. August survived prohibition by pivoting to other products, but he didn't survive the psychic weight of it. The empire he inherited demanded constant feeding, constant growth, constant vigilance, and eventually it consumed him. His suicide in 1934 wasn't just the death of one man, it was the first crack in the foundation, the first sign that maybe wealth couldn't insulate you from despair after all. Peter Busch shooting David Leaker in 1976 was the second crack. It revealed that the empire's protection extended not just to financial security, but to legal immunity, that you could kill a man in your own home and walk away with probation because your last name carried that much weight. August Busch IV. Losing the company in 2008 was the third crack, proof that even 150 years of control could evaporate if you didn't own enough shares, that the market was more powerful than legacy. And Adrienne Martin dying in August IV's bed in 2010 was the final crack, a reminder that some patterns repeat until someone forces them to stop, and nobody had forced anything to stop for a very long time. The workers who built Grant's farm are ghosts. We don't know their names. We don't know if they had families, if they lived to see the mansion completed, if they died on the job or years later from injuries sustained while hauling limestone or installing Tiffany windows. What we know is that in 1913, nearly 25,000 American workers died in industrial accidents, and that number doesn't include the ones who died later from illnesses caused by unsafe working conditions, lung diseases, cancers, infections that antibiotics couldn't treat because antibiotics didn't exist yet. The men who built the big house were expendable, and the mansion stands as a monument to that expendability, a 3-story middle finger to the idea that labor has dignity when the laborers themselves are invisible. The beer that funded Grant's farm was sold to working-class Americans who couldn't afford mansions but could afford a nickel for a Budweiser after a 12-hour shift in a factory or mine or mill. The profit margin on that nickel was tiny, but when you sell billions of nickels, the margins add up. Anheuser-Busch became the largest brewery in America by selling cheap beer to people who needed it to forget for a few hours how hard their lives were. And the Busch family took that money and built palaces and bought baseball teams and collected exotic animals and told themselves they were job creators, that they were contributing to society, that their success was evidence of their virtue. Maybe they believed it. People usually do. The sale to InBev in 2008 was the moment the myth died. For 156 years, the Busch family had run Anheuser-Busch, and St. Louis had watched their fortunes rise and fall with a kind of civic pride, like the Bushes were royalty, and their success reflected well on the city. But when InBev took over, it became clear that the Busch family had never really owned the company in any meaningful sense. They'd owned 4% of the shares, which gave them influence but not control. The workers who brewed the beer didn't own any shares. The executives who managed operations owned some, but not enough to matter. The real owners were shareholders scattered across the globe, pension funds and hedge funds, and investment firms that didn't care about St. Louis or legacy or the Busch name. They cared about return on investment, and when InBev offered $70 a share, the shareholders took it. August Busch IV could have fought harder, but fighting requires leverage, and he didn't have any. The empire his great-great-grandfather built was sold in a conference room to men who spoke Dutch and Portuguese, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Since 2021, the 5-member Busch ownership group has run Grant's farm directly, without Anheuser-Busch InBev as an intermediary. They've kept it free and open to the public, maintained the Clydesdales, preserved the Bauernhof and the animal exhibits. They've done everything they said they would do, and the big house still sits behind its wall of trees, private and inaccessible, a relic of an era when American industrialists built palaces and called it progress. Tourists drive past it on their way to feed goats, maybe catching a glimpse of red brick through the foliage, maybe not even noticing it's there. The mansion doesn't appear in any of the promotional materials. It's not part of the tour. It exists in the same way ghosts exist, acknowledged but unseen, present but untouchable. The irony is that Ulysses S. Grant, the man who originally farmed this land, understood failure in a way the Bushes never did. Grant built his cabin with his own hands and called it hardscrabble because nothing about it was easy. He tried to make a living from the land and failed. He went off to fight in the Civil War and became a general and eventually president. But he never forgot what it felt like to be broke and desperate and building a cabin out of necessity rather than choice. The Bushes built a palace on land Grant had once farmed, and they never had to know what desperation felt like because their money insulated them from it. August Busch Sr. put a gun to his stomach in 1934, but that wasn't desperation. That was pain, physical and psychic, the kind that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. Desperation is not knowing if you'll eat tomorrow. Desperation is working 12 hours a day and still falling behind on rent. The Bushes never knew desperation. They knew pressure, expectation, the burden of legacy. But desperation was for the workers who built their mansion and died without anyone remembering their names. There's a philosophical question buried in all. Is it possible to build an empire without bodies? Can you extract that much wealth from that many people over that many generations and still claim your hands are clean? The Bushes would probably say yes. They'd point to the jobs they created, the taxes they paid, the charities they funded, the fact that Anheuser-Busch employed tens of thousands of people and contributed billions to the economy. They'd say that wealth is not a zero-sum game, that their success didn't require anyone else's failure. But the math doesn't support that argument. The 23,000 industrial deaths in 1913 weren't abstract statistics. They were men who went to work and didn't come home, men whose families were left with nothing because there were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no unions strong enough to protect them. The workers who built Grant's farm were part of that 23,000, or they were survivors of a system that treated them as replaceable. And the mansion they built still stands, beautiful and cold, a monument to the fact that some people get to live in palaces and some people get to build them, and those two groups almost never overlap. August Busch Sr. Suicide is often framed as a personal tragedy, the sad end of a great man undone by illness and stress. But suicide is also an escape, a way of saying the weight has become unbearable and you're choosing to put it down. August chose to put it down in his mansion, surrounded by the wealth he'd spent his life preserving. He left behind a note, "Goodbye, precious mommy and adorable children," and a bullet in his stomach. The note is touching, in its way, the kind of thing you'd want to believe if you were his family. But it doesn't explain why he chose a gun instead of morphine, or why he aimed for his stomach instead of his head, or why he waited until Prohibition ended before pulling the trigger. Maybe he wanted to make sure the empire would survive without him. Maybe he wanted one last chance to see the brewery legalized again before he gave up. Maybe there's no good explanation, and that's the point. Despair doesn't always make sense, but the mansion survived him, and his children moved into it, and the cycle continued. Peter Busch killing David Leaker is framed as an accident, a tragic mistake involving a gun and two young men who should have known better. Peter claimed the gun went off as he tossed it onto a bed. Maybe that's true. Guns do go off accidentally, though usually not when handled by people who claim to be familiar with them. And Peter had a history with firearms. He'd already shot himself in the leg once. The police investigated. Peter was charged with manslaughter, not murder, which suggests they didn't believe he intended to kill David, but also didn't buy the story completely. Peter pleaded guilty and got 5 years probation. David Leaker was buried, his parents grieved, and Peter Busch went on to run a beer distributorship in Florida. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work for people with money and power. Punishment was theoretical, consequences were optional, and the family closed ranks to protect its own. August Busch IV, walking away from Michelle Frederick's death in 1983, is framed as a legal failure, a case where evidence wasn't sufficient to press charges. August claimed amnesia from his fractured skull, which is convenient because you can't be held accountable for what you can't remember. The crash happened late at night. Michelle Frederick died. August was found hours later at his home. A 7-month investigation turned up nothing usable. The authorities declined to prosecute. August went on to become CEO of Anheuser-Busch. Michelle Frederick stayed dead. The symmetry is almost poetic. A young woman dies, a young man walks away, the system shrugs, and life continues as if nothing happened. Except something did happen. Michelle Frederick is still dead. Her family still grieves. And August Busch IV still carries that with him, or he doesn't, and we'll never know which because he's never been required to answer for it publicly. Adrienne Martin's death in 2010 is framed as a mystery, though mysteries usually involve missing information rather than missing accountability. Adrienne was found dead in August Busch IV's bed. There were no signs of trauma. The initial report suggested overdose as a possibility. August's lawyer said there was nothing suspicious. The investigation dragged on for weeks, then months, then quietly closed. Adrienne Martin was 27 years old. She'd been dating August Busch IV. She died in his home. And August, once again, walked away. The pattern holds. Women die. Busch heirs are questioned. No charges are filed. Life continues. At some point, you have to ask whether this is a pattern of bad luck or something structural, something baked into the way wealth and power interact with the legal system in ways that benefit the wealthy and powerful every single time. The Busch family's relationship with Grant's Farm since 2017 has been marketed as a preservation effort, a way of honoring legacy and keeping a piece of St. Louis history intact for future generations. And maybe that's true. Maybe the 5 Busch heirs who bought the property for $51 million genuinely care about maintaining it as a public space where families can visit for free and connect with animals and history. Or maybe it's a branding exercise, a way of keeping the Busch name relevant in a city where the brewery is now owned by a European conglomerate, and the Cardinals haven't been owned by the family since 1996. Legacy is what you leave behind, but it's also what you convince people to remember. And the Busch family has been very good at convincing people to remember the Clydesdales, and the free beer, and the charitable donations, while forgetting the bodies piled up along the way. The workers who built Grant's Farm worked without safety nets, without health insurance, without any meaningful legal protection. If they died on the job, their families received nothing unless they could prove negligence, which was nearly impossible because the courts were stacked in favor of employers. If they got injured, they were fired and replaced. If they complained, they were blacklisted. This wasn't unique to Grant's Farm or Anheuser-Busch. This was the norm across American industry in the early 20th century. But the fact that it was normal doesn't make it acceptable. It just means the brutality was widespread, systemic, baked into the economy in ways that benefited people like August Busch Sr. at the expense of people whose names we'll never know. And the mansion still stands, beautiful and permanent, while the workers who built it are long dead and forgotten. The Budweiser empire made billions by selling beer to working-class Americans. Those same Americans, in many cases, worked in factories and mines and mills under conditions that would be illegal today. They worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for wages that barely covered rent and food. They bought Budweiser with the little money they had left because beer was cheap and drinking was one of the few pleasures available to people whose lives were otherwise defined by labor and exhaustion. The Busch family took that money and built palaces. They weren't alone. Every major American industrialist did the same thing. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan. They all extracted wealth from workers who had no leverage and no alternatives, and they all built monuments to their own success while telling themselves they were benefactors of civilization. Maybe they believed it. Maybe belief is the lie you tell yourself to sleep at night when you're surrounded by Tiffany glass and ornamental plaster and the ghosts of men who died building your palace. The question Grant's Farm forces you to confront is whether American capitalism can ever be separated from violence. Not the spectacular violence of war or revolution, but the quiet violence of exploitation, the slow grind of people working themselves to death for wages that never lift them out of poverty, the structural violence of a system that lets some people build empires while others build the buildings those empires are housed in. The Busch family didn't invent this system. They didn't create the conditions that made 23,000 industrial deaths in 1913 acceptable to American society. But they benefited from it. They took the profits generated by that system and turned them into a mansion, a zoo, a dynasty. And when the system finally turned on them in 2008, when InBev swooped in and bought the brewery out from under them, they learned what it feels like to be powerless in the face of forces you can't control. The difference is that they got $52 billion for their trouble. The workers who built Grant's Farm got 20 cents an hour and a burial plot. The legacy of Grant's Farm is complicated. On one level, it's a generous gift to the public. 281 acres of free entertainment, educational programs about animals and history, a place where families can make memories without spending money. On another level, it's a monument to inequality, a physical reminder that wealth in America has always been built on the backs of people who had no choice but to provide the labor. The mansion is beautiful. The grounds are immaculate. The Clydesdales are majestic. And none of it exists without the nameless workers who sweated and bled and sometimes died to make it real. That's the bargain at the heart of American capitalism. Some people get to enjoy the fruits, and some people get to do the work. And the people who do the work are almost never the people who enjoy the fruit. The Busch family's decline, if you can call it that when you still have millions of dollars and a 281-acre estate, mirrors the decline of American industrial dynasties in general. They built empires in an era when labor was cheap and regulations were non-existent, and they maintained those empires by diversifying, adapting, staying one step ahead of market forces. But eventually, the market caught up. Global competition made it impossible to maintain family control without sacrificing equity. The rise of shareholder capitalism meant that companies were no longer run for the benefit of families or workers, but for the benefit of investors who demanded maximum returns. The Bushes sold off shares to raise capital, and in doing so, they sold off control. By 2008, they were figureheads in their own company, and when InBev made an offer the shareholders couldn't refuse, the Bushes had to accept it because they didn't have the votes to say no. It's almost poetic. The system they'd benefited from for 150 years finally turned on them, and they were powerless to stop it. But here's the thing. Even in defeat, the Bushes landed on their feet. August Busch IV got a seat on the InBev board. The family retained ownership of Grant's Farm. They still have wealth, connections, influence. They lost the company, but they didn't lose their lives, their freedom, or their futures. Compare that to the workers who built the mansion and died anonymous, or the workers who brewed the beer and lived paycheck to paycheck, or Michelle Frederick and Adrienne Martin, who died in circumstances the Busch heirs walked away from. The distance between those outcomes is the distance between power and powerlessness, between having a safety net and having nothing. And that distance is the entire story of American capitalism in miniature. So what's left? A mansion behind trees. A zoo full of animals, tourists feeding goats, free beer samples, Clydesdales posing for photographs, a family name that still means something in St. Louis, even if it doesn't mean what it used to. And underneath all of it, buried in the foundation, the cost that nobody talks about, the workers who died building it, the women who died in proximity to it, the best friend who took a bullet and got his killer probation, the president who shot himself rather than carry the weight any longer. Grant's Farm is many things, a tourist attraction, a family legacy, a piece of St. Louis history, but most of all, it's a monument to the question America has never been willing to answer honestly. How much does an empire cost, and who pays the price? The last time Ulysses S. Grant stood on this land, he was a failed farmer trying to scratch a living from dirt that didn't want to cooperate. He called his cabin hardscrabble because nothing was easy, and he meant it. He understood failure in a way that success never teaches you. The Bushes built a palace on land Grant had once farmed, and they filled it with Tiffany glass and marble floors and exotic animals, and they told themselves this was progress. This was the American dream made manifest. But progress is a story we tell ourselves about the past to justify the present. And dreams are what you have when you can afford to sleep through the night without wondering if you'll eat tomorrow. Grant knew what it meant to fail. The Bushes knew what it meant to succeed. And in between those two states lies the entire architecture of American capitalism. Who wins, who loses, who builds, who benefits, who dies, and who gets to write the history. Grant's Farm is still there, open to visitors, free to the public. Maintained by a family that bought it back for $51 million to preserve a legacy that's equal parts philanthropy and self-mythology. The mansion sits behind trees, private and inaccessible, a French chateau in Missouri soil, built by men whose names we'll never know, financed by beer sold to workers who could barely afford it, haunted by suicides and shootings, and women who died, and heirs who walked away. The Clydesdales are beautiful, the animals are well cared for, the grounds are immaculate. And if you listen closely on a quiet morning, you might hear something underneath it all. The sound of hammers and saws, the sound of men working 12-hour shifts for 20 cents an hour, the sound of a revolver firing in a second-floor bedroom, the sound of a bullet entering a best friend's skull, the sound of women dying and empires falling and fortunes changing hands. Or maybe you won't hear anything. Maybe the past is quiet, and all that's left is a mansion, a zoo, and a question nobody seems interested in answering. Was it worth it? And if it was, for whom?